Thank you very much for that reading. It needed to be broken up into different sections, mainly for time, but it's really important to try and get actually a whole flavour of the text that we're going to be looking at. And just to introduce myself, so my name's Paul. I'm a member here of the congregation. And to be honest with you, over the last 6 to 9 months, I've been wrestling quite a lot with the Bible and through that with God. I've been wrestling with the fact that I've been struggling with aspects of the Old Testament. I've been struggling with the bits where it seems like God's justice gets expressed through violence, through God's act of, or God causing slavery, sexual violence, all seems to be part of God's justice. And I struggled with that, and I was getting quite angry. Poor Dan had to listen to a couple of my rants once or twice with his gentle listening ear. And then as I was praying about it, and then I end up finding out what passage I've got to preach on. And I've got one of those lovely passages to preach on, which sometimes when you pray, you don't quite get that answer to prayer you're hoping for. And this is one of those examples. Here's a section that we didn't quite read out, but Joel articulates how the people have come against Israel in the past and how they've taken them captive and used them as slaves and for prostitution and for other things. And this is how Joel really sees the aspect of God's day of judgment coming. And it says, God says, "Now what have you against me? Are you trying to repay me for something I have done? If you are paying me back, I will swiftly and speedily return on your own heads what you have done. For you took off my silver and my gold, you've carried off my finest treasures to your temples. You sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, that you might send them far from their homeland. See, I am going to rouse them out of the places to which you've sold them, and I will return on your own heads what you have done. I will sell your sons and daughters to the people of Judah, and that they're going to sell them on to the other nations far away." Is this the God that we know? And this is somehow aspects of what we wrestle with. And I've had to wrestle with it. I did actually partly think, well, maybe I just get what the kind of theme is from what I think God's saying to us as a community today. And I focus the readings on that, and I kind of just skip over some of these bits. You know, that was part of the thing, but that's not doing quite justice to the passage. And actually, that's not helping us as a community of how we wrestle with some of these passages. And actually, as I've done that, it's changed some of my anger actually to wonder and to challenge. But my problem is I've only got 20 minutes. And I would be happily able to talk about this passage for about an hour or two. But I have made a promise to Dan, so I'm going to try and occasionally keep looking at the clock to make sure that I try and stick within that. But what's this about? This is about how do we explore the day of the Lord? How do we understand that? What did it mean to Joel, and what might that mean to us? And I think what the best way of doing this is actually we're going to explore it in a few different ways. We're actually going to look at what was Joel's understanding, and I'm going to do that really quickly. And so, yeah, it might feel like, whoa, that's gone really quick. What are all these points? But actually, I'll be coming back to them again later. So we're going to look at Joel's understanding. We're then actually going to start looking at, well, what did Peter understand this to mean? And what did Jesus understand the day of the Lord to mean? And actually, we then see how there was conflict between Peter and Jesus in the Bible and in the Gospels about their misunderstanding or their different interpretations of what this passage meant. And then we will then cycle back to what we find out in Joel and look at what that might mean for us. So, let's look at this really quickly. What was Joel's understanding? What can we read in this passage that really highlights aspects and characteristics of what the day of the Lord meant? Well, first of all, it meant restoration. It meant restoration, and we saw that in some of those readings. We saw that there was a removal of shame, The Jewish people Israel were ashamed because they have been defeated. They're not a proud nation anymore that they were once before under King David and King Solomon. They're living under other nations, and the fact of, we heard from Simon yesterday, the locusts had come and consumed all of their grain. They were in poverty as a nation. You know, this wasn't a place to be proud of. There wasn't gratitude. But in this passage, Joel says that the day of the Lord will come, shame will be removed from our people. The land will become fruitful. It's become a desolate place after all of the hordes of locusts have come through. But that's going to be renewed. We see in verse 25, what the locusts, I will pay you for the years of the locusts have eaten, the great locusts and the young, the other locusts and the swarm, my great armies that I sent among you. You will have plenty to eat until you are full, and you will praise the name of the Lord your God. So there's a restoration of the land. There's a restoration of the people of Israel. It says that God's going to draw Israel from all the places that it's been scattered, and it's going to become a new people. And then at the end, we've heard that actually there was going to be water flowing from the temple, which picks up the imagery that was actually used by an earlier prophet, Ezekiel, about how actually water is going to flow. There's going to be abundance flowing from the temple of God at the heart of Israel and Jerusalem out into the other nations. So there's restoration, complete restoration of the people. But then there's justice. Justice is going to come. So God's going to bring justice. So the restored people of Israel, as they gather, they're going to become warriors. They're going to change their plows, make them into swords. They're going to implement God's justice on the people in the same way, like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. What they've done to us, we're going to be able to do to them and restore the boundaries and restore justice, because that's what justice meant. But also, once they've done that, the nations are going to come to Israel, where they're going to be judged. They're going to come to the valley near Jerusalem, where they're going to be judged. So that's like a really quick cover of what was covered in that passage. So let's now quickly explore, well, what did Peter and Jesus make of this passage? Some of you may be familiar that Peter uses this passage later on, in the day of Pentecost. But I'm not going to start there. I'm actually going to start earlier in the Gospels. And actually what we see is that Peter's understanding of the day of the Lord was just the same as the rest of the Israelites at that period of time. They were still expecting a very literal understanding and interpretation of this. God's going to come, bring a Messiah. That Messiah is going to regather the Israelite people. They're then going to become an army, and that they're going to then defeat the armies of the people that are currently suppressing Israelites. That had happened about 60 or 100 years beforehand with the Maccabean revolution. Somebody had come, ridden their horse through the gates of Jerusalem into Jerusalem. People were waving their palm branches as they entered into Jerusalem, and they set Jerusalem free from the nations, the Greeks that were there that had desecrated it. And they were going to re-establish the proud aspects of Judah and the Judean culture that was being suppressed by the Greeks. That didn't work out so well. And that came in the end to an end. But that fire was still as part of the people. So Peter, when Jesus was saying he was going to die, Peter was like, look, no, you're not. You're really not, because I know that you're the Messiah and you're going to lead us into victory. And Jesus had to say to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You don't have the things and the understanding of the world. That real conflict, really strong, being referenced. And then even in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was being arrested, but Peter came with his sword, sliced off the ear, of the people that were coming to take Jesus. Still with this understanding, absolutely, we're going to win this by violence. But then Jesus said, put back your sword in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say that it must happen this way? You can see why Peter's confused. And then Jesus dies. And the confusion and the desolation is rampant for him. But that's not quite the end of Peter's story. He then experiences and meets Jesus through his resurrection. And then the day of Pentecost comes. And the Holy Spirit comes upon the people that are gathered together in the upper room. And then he then realizes, now maybe he's been told this by the people that Simon mentioned last week, that journeyed with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. And that's wrong, isn't it? But anyway, you know the two people that were walking back from Jerusalem, and they met Jesus, and Jesus explained through all the prophets what was supposed to take place. Now maybe they then, when they rushed back and met with the other disciples, they then explained it to them. I don't know. Or maybe Peter was just aware. But he took this passage, this thing about this day of the Lord, and now understood it as to be really happening now. For the Spirit of the God was poured out upon them. That brought a new understanding. But only, I think, actually, probably at this point, a part understanding. He partly knew that this was now the day of the Lord. God's Spirit has been poured out on all people. But they probably didn't quite understand what this then meant for the rest of the passage. But it did start to come to them. We then start to see, as the Gospels were starting to be written, and John was written, how the disciples really understood what Jesus was saying in his teaching. We then get a glimpse of what Jesus was meaning by the day of the Lord. There's lots of different references, but I'm just going to focus on one passage that's being represented in the Gospel of John. On the Day of Tabernacles, which is part of the celebration, is where they pour water onto the altar in the center of the temple in Jerusalem, and allow that water to flow out, symbolizing partly this bit from Joel and also from Ezekiel about the flowing of the blessing of water. But Jesus says in that ceremony, on that day, he comes in and he says, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." You see, Jesus reinterprets what's going on here with the temple and the water, and says actually the water isn't about water flowing from the temple, it's about the Spirit of God coming. And it's not going to come from the temple, but it's actually going to come from me. For I am the Messiah, through my body it's going to come. And through the people who believe in me, that same flowing of the Spirit and of water will come from their hearts out into the community and bring transformation, renewal, restoration, as well as seeking to bring justice, God's justice on this land. That's what Jesus' message was about. And then in John's Gospel, at the end, he includes that amazing detail about Jesus being speared in his side, and out of that side flows both blood and water. You know, that's not there just for a biological kind of understanding that Jesus might have died. That's there to symbolize, through Jesus' death, now the day of the Lord has come. The Spirit is being flowing from Jesus' death. So the gospel writers finally really got to understand that actually understanding Joel is not to take things literally, not to see that this is what God really is like, this picture that God has presented, but actually we need to interpret it with the understanding that Jesus brings from the New Testament, looking at it more allegorically and interpreting what that might mean for us today. So that's what I hope to do quickly now in the next couple of 10 minutes or so. And so we're now going to go back. And, oh yeah, that was a picture of the temple. So, sorry, I got carried away and forgot the slides. But here, the same idea. So actually what we're saying is, the disciples and Jesus understood that the day of the Lord was now. It was in their time, which means it's also in our time. It wasn't just a future thing that's going to happen. But today, we can look at the same passage and understand we're looking for the same things, for restoration and for justice. But what does that mean? today. I think it means the same sort of things. There's no shame. Jesus came and brought about so that shame would be removed. Forgiveness is available. There's no need to hide from God. We can be, again, in that unique relationship with God, and there need be no condemnation for those who have put their trust and their faith in Jesus Christ, and that he will restore our relationship with God. But it's not just about restoring relationship with God, it's about restoring humanity. When God created humanity back in Genesis, he breathed his very life and being into humanity. And that's what we see again now. The Spirit of God is not sort of some other part. It's actually the very divine self who created the heavens and the stars living within us and within our hearts and our beings. That's a mystery. But that's the restoration. That's what God had created humanity to be from the very beginning. And yet somehow we lost our way. And here we're saying that part of the day of the Lord is that restoration is available now, as we read and seek and be aware of the Spirit of God being at work in our hearts. And through that working of God's Spirit in our hearts and our very being, the restoration of us restoring us into humanity is that we become fruitful. The fruitfulness is not coming from the trees of the land, but coming from the very people of Israel. And the fruit is not wine or good grapes or food, but it's actually the fruit of the Spirit that God's wanting to birth in us, that we might seek to be able to be fruitful in our lives in the service and the purposes that God had for humanity from the very beginning. So there's full restoration. And for some that are here this morning or are joining us online, that's actually maybe all you need to hear. That actually that idea and that thought of having your true humanity being restored by the one of the God who made the stars, it brought that sense of longing of being able to belong again to God. And how does that happen? Well, we follow Jesus' words, which was, "Come to me, all who are thirsty, and I will bring you life." But note that the Spirit of God was not coming from an external thing on them. It did for the disciples, but in Jesus' words here and from John, actually it's the Spirit of God coming from within our own hearts. So actually it's about being sensitive and aware to the work of the Spirit in us. Once we've said to God and to Jesus, "Look, I know you hold restoration of life. I want to be a part of that." Then let the Spirit of God move in our hearts and be aware. I've found that for me, often the only way I can do that is actually through prayer, stillness, and silence. But stillness and silence don't think that I've got to stay stationary and I've got to be silent. For me, stillness and silence is most accurate when actually I'm out walking in the forest and I'm listening to the bird song. But it's a stillness of silence within our hearts. I've had to sort of grow in that aspect of actually being quiet without people. But now I'm trying to learn, how can I be still and silent in my conversations with people? How can I have that stillness and silence within my heart, that I'm aware of what God's Spirit is saying and doing, aware of my security and identity in that place of being as I'm having a conversation with somebody, so I can hear what they're doing. Maybe I can see what God's doing in their life and offer hope and sanctuary and belonging to them. Or in my worship too, how do I enter noise and worship and joy while still having silence and stillness and being internal? And for me, that's still an onward-going journey. And I'd love to speak further with people about how they've experienced that and what works for them. So maybe that's it, all you need to hear. And actually maybe ignore the rest of what I'm going to say and just dwell on that. But for some others, maybe there's more. Because actually God hasn't called us just to sit at his feet and listen to his words. He's called us to act, to implement justice. God's people in Joel's passage were to become warriors. They were to go out, the nations were to come to them. But actually Jesus sent the 12 and the 72 from Jerusalem out into the world. What does it mean to become a warrior today? Today's Armistice Day, isn't it? There's an aspect of that which for some people in very select times it does require, and they feel called to take up arms to try and implement justice. And we're very thankful for the sacrifice that many people have done in order to do that in so many different ways. But I think that there's an example in this passage of other ways we can do it for everyone. In the passage, it talked about, let's take our plows and form them into swords. What does that mean in an agricultural society? It means let's rip up and change the economic basis in which is happening at the moment, and let's use it as a tool and an instrument for justice. Let's use the format of our economy and the economic systems and make them an instrument for justice. Those that know me, forgive a slight indulgence. But for me, this is actually core of part of where I am and the decisions of the lifestyle that I have. So for me, what does it mean? It means refusing to buy into the mass production of meat and dairy, of hen farms that are leaving rivers barren, the commercialization of our animals that reduces God's creation to financial value only, so that the males are just destroyed because they're of no value economically, and yet they are part of God's creation. It means where there's abundance of life in the rainforests, not destroying them in order to produce cattle farming and soya production for feed. This is what we're being called to do in the sense of changing our economic systems in order to implement justice. It also means fighting injustice where children have been hurt and excluded from society, marginalized within an education system that's looking for results. It means taking a stand, being a painful presence as a teacher, as a working support assistant, to try and disrupt that system, to bring hope and value to the children that are in that system, and changing it. It's hard, it's hurtful, it's painful. It means valuing people irrespective of the financial value that they offer to the economy. It means running a business not for the value of everybody, not just for your profit or for your shareholders. I won't go into the water companies and the issue that we've got at the moment on that. Maybe it means that not only do we take our environmental commitment to being carbon neutral as a church for our church buildings, but we work out ways in which actually, as families, as a people, we reduce our carbon footprint in our own homes, and we look to work out how we collectively can work together and share each other's resources to achieve that goal. Is that what Joel's meaning? A disruption in order to seek God's justice, because we're not just called to sit at Jesus' feet, but we are called also to take action. I had not long been here at this church, and I started to hear a story from a couple of people in different ways. And it was actually a story of Bishop that describes the church here as being a Martha church. It was a church that was full of action. And it was said to me in the context of we need to sit at Jesus' feet more. We need to hear and spend more time with him. And I think that that was right. But we need to be careful that as a community we don't live that story and leave it there. Because actually true freedom comes not only from sitting at Jesus' feet, but then using that inflow of his Spirit to reach out into the world and to bring justice. James Cohen once said that actually you can only understand true freedom once you're able to give that up and identify yourself with those who are not free. So this is how I've come to understand Joel 2 and 3. A complete change. One that was leaving me to anger, to one that actually brought hope and I understood the restoration and the fact of the beauty of God's word, of how it's expressed both in Old Testament, and those stories and themes get expressed both in Old Testament through the work of Jesus and into our life today. Amen.